Part 1, the British Army had been driven back to Dunkirk and faced possible extinction, and the French Army, north of the River Somme, had effectively collapsed. Unexpectedly, the commander of Germany's Army Group A, General Gerd von Rundstedt, halted his Panzer, a decision that was endorsed by Hitler. Meanwhile, the Italian government, through their ambassador in London, proposed to the British Foreign Secretary that Mussolini would broker a deal with Hitler. The 6 members of the British War Cabinet, led by Winston Churchill, were required to decide whether to continue with the war against Germany or seek peace terms with Hitler. By 4 o'clock on the afternoon of Sunday the 26th of May, 1940, the Germans finally broke through the British defences in Calais, leaving Brigadier Nicholson with little option other than to surrender. The British had sustained 300 killed and 200 wounded, while German losses amounted to around 800 killed and wounded. Churchill would later report the incident to the House of Commons, saying,
"After 4 days of intense street fighting, silence now reigns over Calais, marking the end of a memorable resistance."
After Reynaud's departure, the War Cabinet reconvened in Admiralty House for their 3rd meeting that day. Attlee immediately emphasized the importance of keeping France in the war as a way of deterring Hitler from turning his full attention upon Britain. Churchill agreed and stressed that the United Kingdom must not weaken its position by entering negotiations. Halifax, however, openly disagreed, saying,
"I attach rather more importance than the Prime Minister to the desirability of allowing France to try out the possibilities of European equilibrium."
He continued by saying that it was important to reason with Mussolini over the balance of power in Europe. Greenwood pointed out that it was not within Mussolini's power to take an independent line to Hitler, and Chamberlain added that Mussolini could only take an independent line if Hitler allowed him to do so. Again, playing for time, Churchill suggested that nothing should be decided about this matter until the evacuation of the BEF from Dunkirk had been completed. While acknowledging that the evacuation, to be known as Operation Dynamo, might fail, he was confident that a significant portion of the BEF could be saved, but this would largely depend upon air cover. It was agreed that Halifax should draft for discussion the following day a possible communication to Italy and provide a minute of his latest meeting with Bastianini. Back in Downing Street, Churchill, together with Anthony Eden, set about putting into action the evacuation of the BEF from France. At 6:57, Churchill telephoned Admiral Bertram Ramsay in Dover and issued him direct instructions to commence Operation Dynamo, an operation for which Ramsay had been planning for the past week. Meanwhile, Eden sent a signal to Gort, officially instructing him to fall back to the coast, while Churchill sent a message to General Weygand confirming that British troops had been instructed to withdraw within defended area around Dunkirk. Again, it appears that Weygand was given no indication of British intentions to evacuate, while General Blanchard later claimed that he remained ignorant of British intentions to evacuate for a further 2 days until informed personally by Gort at a meeting on the morning of the 28th of May. That same evening, the RAF was directed to provide air cover for the evacuation. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park's 11th Fighter Group was instructed to undertake patrols to prevent Luftwaffe Stukas and bombers attacking the Dunkirk area. The War Cabinet assembled for a long and arduous session to discuss military strategy in the event of France's fall. Even though at one point Chamberlain surmised that Mussolini would join the war as soon as Paris fell, the War Cabinet agreed to postpone any discussion on that subject until 4:30 that afternoon, when they would also consider Halifax's proposed message to Mussolini. During the First World War, Italy had been one of the Allies in the defeat of Germany. After the war, Benito Mussolini realized that Italy would never be able to equal the status of the bigger European powers, and therefore decided to position Italy as a decisive counterbalance in Europe. Where there were two competing camps, Italy would align itself to the one or the other in order to maintain equilibrium in Europe. However, this policy began to unravel in March 1938, when Germany annexed Austria. As one of the victors of the First World War, Italy had been responsible for the protection of a now weak Austria from predators. But that year, Italy failed to prevent Germany, still not fully mobilized, from taking control of Austria. Then, in May 1939, Mussolini agreed to sign a pact of friendship and alliance with Germany, known as the Pact of Steel. Not long afterwards, in August, Germany agreed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. Mussolini immediately realized that he had been outmaneuvered by Hitler, as this allowed Hitler, little more than a week later, to unilaterally start a war in Europe with the invasion of Poland. However, by May 1940, Hitler's lightning victories in Poland, Norway, Denmark, and the Netherlands, plus the imminent defeat of France and Belgium, plus an ignoble retreat by the British, demonstrated the complete failure of Mussolini's policy of European equilibrium. With German propaganda starting to be critical of Italian neutrality, Mussolini feared that Italy would be the next to be invaded by Germany. But with France and Britain still in the fight, his best option of self-protection was to attempt to deliver France and Britain to Hitler through mediation, which, at the same time, might produce benefits for Italy in the form of territorial acquisition. Failing that, Mussolini would find it necessary to ally Italy with Germany. At 4:30 p.m., the War Cabinet was joined by Sir Alexander Cadogan, the Secretary of State for the Dominions. Halifax presented his suggested communiqué to the Italians, which was based upon Britain, joined with France, making a direct approach to Italy. The situation that Italy would face if Germany dominated Europe was laid out. As an alternative, the Allies would include Italy in a settlement of all European issues, especially any geographical questions in which Mussolini was primarily interested. The draft further suggested that Britain and France would recommend an initiative by President Roosevelt to ensure Italian issues would be determined. Halifax then found himself having to admit that since writing the draft, he'd been informed about Mussolini's resentment of Roosevelt for a supposed previous and unwarranted interference in Italian affairs. Churchill cast doubt upon Roosevelt's involvement, while Chamberlain maintained that Italy was bound to join the war on Germany's side as a way of sharing the spoils. Meanwhile, Sinclair was completely opposed to any direct approach to Mussolini, but would support an intervention by Roosevelt. He further expressed concern about damage to national morale if the government was perceived as acting weakly. Attlee agreed, adding that Mussolini was never satisfied with anything offered to him and always wanted more, while Greenwood felt that France would soon be defeated, making negotiations fruitless. Having heard these options, Churchill proposed dismissing any approach to Mussolini, describing them as futile, dangerous, and ruinous to the integrity of Britain's fighting position. France, he claimed, needed to make a strong stand, and Britain should not be dragged down with France. Therefore, Britain should assure France that whatever happened, Britain would fight it out to the end. Chamberlain sought some nuance to their position, as an outright refusal to Italy might be unhelpful in their efforts to persuade France to keep fighting. Halifax agreed, saying he was in favour of getting France to fight to the end, but he resented the suggestion that his approach amounted to suing for peace. he challenged Churchill on his apparent change of position from the previous day, when he had understood the Prime Minister to have been prepared to discuss offers. While he did not expect any acceptable offer to come from Hitler, he believed it would still be possible to obtain an acceptable European-wide settlement. He thus could not agree with Churchill's statement. Churchill replied that he would not join France in requesting terms, but he was prepared to consider any offers received. After further discussion, it was eventually agreed that Churchill should inform Reynaud that the British government wished to await an initiative by President Roosevelt. This was a stormy meeting. The differing views of Churchill and Halifax were now out in the open, and Halifax threatened to resign if his views were ignored. Churchill now had the support of Attlee, Greenwood and Sinclair, while Chamberlain had concluded that while it was pointless to negotiate with Hitler, the French position needed to be accommodated. Although Churchill had effectively won the argument within the War Cabinet, he was still in an awkward position as Halifax and Chamberlain controlled the major support amongst Conservative MPs. Consequently, after the meeting, Churchill met with Halifax in the garden at No. 10 Downing Street to reassure him of his continued value to the government. Soon after the War Cabinet meeting, Churchill received an urgent telephone call from Admiral Sir Roger Keyes, who was in Belgium acting as Churchill's liaison officer to the Belgian King, Leopold II. With the Belgian army collapsing, Keyes had become aware that King Leopold had, in the past hour, decided to capitulate to the Germans. Keyes reported that the king was apparently adamant about surrendering, a decision he had taken without any consultation with either France or Britain, or even his own government. Belgium's surrender was not helpful to the BEF situation, as it opened a gap between the BEF's left flank and the sea, which, if filled by the Germans, could result in the BEF being cut off from Dunkirk. Given the gravity of the situation, a further War Cabinet meeting was called for 10 o'clock that evening. It was also attended by the Chiefs of Staff, which included General Sir John Dill, who had that day replaced General Ironside as head of the British Army. Churchill briefed the War Cabinet on the Belgian surrender and reported that he, and also General Weygand, had already asked the French government to disassociate themselves from the Belgians. Weygand had also ordered Blanchard to fight on, and Churchill had sent a similar instruction to Gort. Also attending this meeting was Duff Cooper, the Minister of Information. There was now a clear need to decide what the British public should be told about the deteriorating situation in France. The home population was still unaware that Calais had fallen, that the Belgian army was capitulating, and that the BEF was being forced to withdraw to Dunkirk. Churchill wanted the seriousness of the situation emphasized, but details should be withheld for the sake of those with relatives fighting in France.
Here is the Midnight News, and this is Alvar Liddell reading it.
Speculation about Operation Dynamo should be avoided until its outcome became more clear. The War Cabinet agreed, and Cooper was instructed to proceed along those lines. Further instructions were given to Duff Cooper, who was now instructed to make a personal statement on BBC Radio that lunchtime. Briefly, he was to explain that the BEF was currently fighting its way back to the coast with the full assistance of the RAF and the Royal Navy. A further statement would be made by the Prime Minister later in the afternoon.
This is the BBC Home and Forces programme. Here is the news, and this is John Snagg reading it.
The War Cabinet also, once again, needed to consider the Italian situation. A telegram received from Washington reported that Mussolini had been entirely negative to any idea of intervention by President Roosevelt. The War Cabinet decided to send the French government a message that they were awaiting developments. Churchill confirmed to the House that Belgium had capitulated in the early hours that morning. He mentioned that a Belgian government in exile would fight on, and he stressed that the British and the French armies continued to fight with powerful assistance from both the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. For security reasons, he could not divulge strategic or operational details, but hoped to say more next week. He concluded by saying,
"Meanwhile, the House should prepare itself for hard and heavy tidings. I have only to add that nothing which may happen in this battle can in any way relieve us of our duty to defend the world cause to which we have vowed ourselves, nor should it destroy our confidence in our power to make our way, as on former occasions in our history, through disaster and through grief to the ultimate defeat of our enemies."
Churchill called a further meeting of the War Cabinet that afternoon to discuss the message received from the French government in response to the British government's awaiting developments message earlier that day. With apparently Germany's Panzers once again on the move, France was now proposing an urgent and immediate direct approach to Italy, which should be made jointly by France and Great Britain. Immediately, a disagreement developed between Churchill and Halifax. By now, Churchill had decided to stand his ground and was adamant against any form of negotiation. Halifax informed colleagues that the Italian ambassador that morning had been pressing the British government to give a clear indication that they would agree to mediation by Italy. Churchill countered by saying that it was clearly the French government's wish to have Mussolini mediating between Britain and Hitler, but it was not the British government's wish. It was therefore an unacceptable scenario. But Halifax contended that mediation was a means of Britain securing its independence through making concessions to Italy. Churchill refuted this by saying that things would be different once Germany had failed in an attempt to invade Britain. Chamberlain now supported Churchill, but Halifax continued to argue that Britain would get better terms now before France capitulated than later in the year after Britain's aircraft factories had all been flattened by German bombers. In a growing and heated exchange between the two, Churchill pointed out that it was the French who wanted the British to meet with Hitler, and, he continued, Hitler would only offer unacceptable terms, as he would hardly be so foolish as to allow the British rearmament to continue. Churchill now concluded, saying it was now quite clear that Reyna was really looking for a way out of the war without breaching France's Allied treaty obligations with Britain. Chamberlain agreed with Churchill's diagnosis and suggested that to keep France in the war, Reyna should be told that this was not the time to make an approach to Mussolini. France and Britain could reach a much better agreement if both continued to fight. Halifax responded by saying he could not see what was wrong with trying out the possibility of mediation through Italy. But by now, the remainder of the War Cabinet had come to the conclusion that an approach to Mussolini would never produce any offer that would be acceptable to the British. Attlee pointed out the necessity of recognizing British public opinion. Given the perilous situation, it was necessary to raise and maintain public morale, which would not be possible if the government bowed to France's wishes. After over 2 hours of argument, the War Cabinet agreed to adjourn so that Chamberlain and Halifax could prepare a draft in reply to Reyna. In the meantime, Churchill called an immediate meeting of the Outer Cabinet. Churchill now needed to discover whether he could carry the support of the majority of MPs, many of whom were supporters of Halifax. Immediately after the War Cabinet meeting, Churchill called a meeting of all 25 members of the Outer Cabinet, which included members from all political parties. This was not an official meeting, so it was never minuted or recorded. However, a record of the meeting exists in the form of a note written shortly afterwards by Hugh Dalton, the newly appointed Labour Minister of Economic Warfare. Churchill began by explaining that over the past few days he had needed to consider the possibility of negotiations with Hitler. However, he had concluded that any terms offered by Hitler would reduce Britain to a slave state ruled by a puppet government. In probably his most dramatic speech of the war, Churchill continued,
"I have thought carefully in these last days whether it was part of my duty to consider entering into negotiations with that man, Hitler. But it was idle to think that, if we tried to make peace now, we should get better terms than if we fought it out. The Germans would demand our naval bases, and much else. It would be called disarmament. We would become a slave state through a British government which would be Hitler's puppet, set up under Mosley or some other such person. And where should we be at the end of all that? On the other side we have immense reserves and advantages. And I am convinced that every one of you would rise up and tear me down from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each one of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground."
There was rapturous support to Churchill's speech, with MPs shaking him by the hand and slapping him on the back. His position was being overwhelmingly supported by the elected members of the British government. Halifax had at last been outmanoeuvred by Churchill, and the decision was made that Britain would continue to fight on until the end. That same day, the British government received separate telegrams from the South African leader, General Jan Smuts, and the Australian Prime Minister, Robert Menzies. Their telegrams confirmed that individually that they had both informed President Roosevelt that their respective countries intended to fight on, even if it was without Britain. They stated they wanted nothing for themselves, as their concern was for the defense of world liberty against Nazi domination. Even though there was clearly Commonwealth support for Churchill's position, should Halifax's political faction have prevailed, then crucially, Britain would have been out of the war, and this would have handed victory in Europe at least to Hitler. These 72 hours from the 26th to the 28th of May 1940 were possibly the most crucial 3 days of the Second World War. And with Germany's military blunder of halting their Panzers, the course of world history had been changed. A final footnote. This story began with Brigadier Claude Nicholson defiantly defending Calais in an attempt to buy time for the BEF to successfully withdraw to Dunkirk. Churchill decreed that there would be no evacuation for the men of the 30th Infantry Brigade, who would be sacrificed for the greater good of the BEF. Whether this made a difference to the outcome is a debatable point. Most of the men, including Brigadier Nicholson, became prisoners of war, enduring the next 5 years in captivity. Nicholson, for much of this time, became one of the most senior British Army officers held in German captivity. However, he would not survive the war and died in clearly mysterious circumstances. According to the death certificate issued by the German authorities, he threw himself out of a window while suffering from depression and died from a resultant skull fracture. André Gerschel, the mayor of Calais, found it necessary to flee his home after the Germans occupied Calais due to his Jewish heritage. He made his way to Vichy, France, believing he would be safe there, but was eventually arrested and taken to the concentration camp at Auschwitz, where he became yet another casualty of the Holocaust. After the war, General Gerd von Rundstedt reflected upon Germany's eventual defeat. Irrespective of what had occurred on Germany's Eastern Front, he reached the conclusion that Germany's failure to destroy the British Army at Dunkirk was the crucial moment that led to Germany's ultimate defeat 5 years later. He was to make the following observation.
We should have known better after the First World War. The French came close to collapse in 1917. The British, even after our offensive against them in 1918, never showed any signs of collapse.
He realized that with Britain standing firm, here was the country around which other Western nations would coalesce in the fight against Hitler.